Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
How to create a sustainable future. How to change. That's what we are discussing here. My name is Alexander. I'm part of the people and culture team at Greiner. In this episode, you will learn about your cognitive skills and how to sustain them in a challenging and changing world. My guest is a distinguished professor of clinical psychology. He specializes on strategies to optimize well-being and performance under stress. Together with his colleagues at Cognacity, he's not only coaching organizations and managers, but also rugby players, Olympic rowing teams, and soccer players from clubs like Arsenal and Chelsea. Welcome, Pieter Kruger.
Alex, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Our time difference is not too big, but geographically we're quite far apart. Where are you at the moment and how are you doing?
I just arrived in South Africa from London yesterday. So I'm spending the week here at our office and flying back in about 10 days' time. So some travel involved, but otherwise all good, thank you.
Is it even okay to ask a psychologist on how he is doing, or is that question going way too far?
No, it's quite nice. We don't get that very often, so it's very nice when somebody occasionally at least asks the question. Thank you.
Pieter, we're going to talk about cognitive skills today, and I'd like to start by asking a personal question. Do you personally find it easy to deal with change, with changing environments? And is there any personal experience in your life that has particularly challenged you and that you would like to share with us?
I think I'm slightly in the advantaged position at the moment that because I get to deal with a lot of people all the time going through change, I've learned a bit and we try and practice what we preach. But if I think about one of the biggest changes I had to go through was at the back end of 2005 when I moved from South Africa to the UK, which was a huge adjustment, just culturally and a new environment, having no network, you had nobody you could rely on, very much dependent on yourself. I very much learned the stresses that comes with uncertainty and change, and I had to learn the hard way how to find skills and ways of dealing with it.
Did you find any personal strategies or any hints on how you coped with that situation?
Yes, I guess initially via trial and error, it would have been much easier if somebody gave me a few clear pointers. And it's just as we'll discuss in the talk as well, the human body doesn't respond well to change and uncertainty. And it's unfortunately one of the most constant factors in life. So I think there would have been easier and faster ways for me to get there. But eventually, I think I've learned from past experience and managed to get there.
And why is it like that? Why does the human body, the human mind, not like change?
Well, if you think about our psychological makeup throughout evolution, the brain's primary function above everything and anything else is to get us alive and well in one piece from today to tomorrow, which means in essence we are wired for survival. So anything along the lines of uncertainty, volatility, complexity, ambiguity would have traditionally, historically meant there's danger lurking around the corner. Now, although times have changed significantly, neurologically, we're still wired fairly similarly. So in any situation, real or imagined, where there's any of these factors with a main undercurrent of uncertainty involved, there's a very strong neurobiochemical reaction. And that unfortunately moves blood away from the thinking part of the brain to the emotional part of the brain, which makes it sometimes quite difficult to apply ourselves when we find ourselves in that perpetual state of stress because of all the changes and the environment around us.
That sounds like quite a bad combination in a world that is dominated by change, isn't it?
Definitely. And I mean, if you think about the undertone, everything, if you describe any day, it seems volatile and complex and uncertain. And this is why we are seeing so many stress-related diseases in modern times. Just the nature of information at our disposal. I mean, in the 18th century, if you didn't know something, you didn't get worried about this. But at the moment, it's geopolitical discord. We see changes in the world, kind of economic climate. So many things we are continuously aware of because of how we use technology just keeps on feeding into this underlying anxiety and stress that we have.
research actually suggests that the amount of information we have to process on a daily basis has doubled in the last 20 years. So what does that do to us humans on a very elementary level?
Well, more recently, research by Professor Daniel Levitin, who's an MIT-trained neuroscientist, claims that it has tripled in the last 5 years. So it's even worse than the original data suggested. So the problem with this is that the filters through which we look at life, which means that your brain cannot physically process everything. So with this vast amount of information coming in, the brain has certain filters in place which will allow some things to come through and block out other things. But it's something we call the Waziati principle, which is an acronym in English that's short for what you see is all there is, meaning any information you hold in your short-term working memory or can immediately recall because it's been placed there over time from the long-term memory will disproportionately change what you see, how you respond, and emotionally how you feel in any given situation. So technology and the sheer volume is changing the filters through which we look at life, having a huge impact on how we actually operate on a day-to-day basis.
Now, I'm just thinking of a day at the office where you have a lot of meetings, you have a lot of information, you get emails, you get messages, you got colleagues coming up to you. Do you have some very simple advice on how to deal with such stressful situations? And maybe there's even a big change looming over you at the same time.
Yes, and there are actually a couple of things involved. Not only do we see the release of cortisol, the stress hormone, in this overloaded environment, but dopamine, which is one of the key neurotransmitters we need to focus and concentrate, gets readily depleted when we continuously spend time on technology. Now, dopamine not only plays a role in focus and concentration, but also in mood regulation. So it has a very big impact on how we feel. Now, your question is, what do we do about this? So it firstly means diary management. Have a plan, because if you just hit the ground running on a Monday and hope for the best, you're going to run into trouble at some point in time. It secondly means time away from technology. So we have to give your brain roughly on the hour this 3 to 5 minute break just to replenish some of the other key neurotransmitters that the brain can recover and rest. It means physical movement, because we get chained to our computers and our desks for 5-6 hours at a time, so we have to move. And then other things like hydration, diet. There's so many things from a recovery perspective we can do to at least biochemically neutralize some of the impact. But it seems sometimes so obvious that we just don't do it because we continuously seem overloaded and overburdened.
That reminds me of an experience I had this morning. I actually went for a run in the morning, and that took quite some effort. Because it was dark, it was cold, it was rainy outside, and I'm thinking, how important is discipline for managing stress, for managing change, and maybe are there any lessons from sports that connect to this?
Yes, it goes back to my previous point in terms of having a plan. So one thing we do in elite sport all the time is there's a very clear structure of what we're going to do to work to the point where you get maximum performance. And thereafter, you don't keep it there, you recover first. So the recovery behaviors become hugely important. But what's very interesting, and I think you'll relate to this if you think about your run this morning, motivation doesn't seem to be the problem, because you know it's good for you to go for a run. You know it's important. And once you get there, it's quite enjoyable. The big problem is the derailers that we find, the obstacles. And if we can identify what are the things that will stop us from actually getting there, that's almost more important to get them out of the way than it is to necessarily have discipline to follow through on the strategy. So it's an interesting bit of both, I guess, in the process. But I find once you identify the derailers and remove them, almost becomes easier to get into the routine that you know would be good for you.
Do you have any examples of these derailers and any hints on how to overcome them?
Oh, definitely. So, one of the key derailers is a basic neurocognitive principle that easy beats later. So anything that seems easy now will be taking precedent over anything that you know will be good for you in the long run. So, for example, if you wake up in the morning and you need to start thinking about which route do I take when I run, what kit will I wear, where's my trainers, you're going to come up with 5 good excuses why you'll hit the snooze button now and you'll go for that run tomorrow morning. So a simple thing you can do to take the stress and the decision making out of the equation, the night before you want to go for a run, take out your running kit, put your shoes down there, decide on which route you're going to do, what time you will leave, how long you will run for. And you'll find if you open your eyes the next morning and the kid is sitting there looking at you, it's so much easier to remove that derailer of then deciding what to do and just get dressed and get on with it.
I love that very simple example, and it is so practical at the same time.
Yes, I mean, we're simple creatures effectively as human beings, but once we understand kind of how do we hack the system a little bit, life becomes so much easier if we get some of these basic things in there.
Can we take this individual experience, these individual challenges to an organizational level now? Because also organizations are facing uncertainty, do have to deal with change. What can we transfer from this individual learnings to the organizational level?
That's a really good question, because as soon as you go to an organizational level, there are so many more moving parts involved. So organizationally, specifically when we work with leadership, we generally say you get three lenses of change. So you get the social change, which is the water cooler chat, what people think will be happening, the typical via the grapevine conversation. You get the rational change, which is the step-by-step in terms of what's expected of people, where will things go. That's the official stance of an organization. But then you bring it back to where we just started, which is the emotional change, how people respond to change. And as we've just said, if you have uncertainty because you don't know, or you don't have enough information, or you're not being included in the process, people have a very strong resistant reaction to any form of change. So probably one of the best things leaders in an organization can do is to understand that unless you make enough information available and take people on the journey with you, people will always have that resistance to the idea of change, because uncertainty is just a place we don't want to go.
That's super interesting to me, because I feel that sometimes in these big projects, it is forgotten to really take people's emotions into considerations. What are some very practical advice for organizations, for leaders on how to tackle that?
I think if you look at the old Elizabeth Kubler-Ross change curve, which I know is maybe a slightly dated model of change, but people find themselves on different parts of the spectrum. Some people are still resistant to the idea. People, specifically like leadership, are so far down the line already because they had time to digest and think about this. So I think the opportunity to create a space for people to feel heard, understood, and acknowledged, that they can ask their questions, where leadership can give clarity, is such an important thing to do. It sometimes feels overkill, but I've seen specifically things like the back end of COVID, when organizations started transitioning back. The organizations where they continuously drip-fed information to people, sometimes people kind of felt, maybe it's too much information, but they were still better off than the ones where the leadership didn't communicate clearly. Because very often behind closed doors and in boardrooms, they discuss the strategy, but they forget that people on the ground they're not privy to these conversations. So the first time they kind of give the rational steps of what's going to happen next, people kind of feel in the dark, and they haven't been included in the process. So in a single sentence, I'd say, more communication is better. The more opportunity you create for people to be heard, the more you communicate top down, the better your organization will be when you come to any form of change.
So communicating clearly, that is something that is very important also for employees' well-being, I guess.
Oh, definitely, because the uncertainty takes us right back to where we started, which means biochemically the body responds to this. And sadly, the flip side of uncertainty is anxiety. That's the emotion you're going to experience. And once people get anxious and we go into self-preservation mode, it changes behavior, it changes communication, it changes interaction. So that's something we want to avoid at all costs.
I know that you and your colleagues at Cognacity, you're working with many organizations as well, with many private firms, corporates. And I'm wondering, what are some of the key factors influencing well-being of employees, maybe besides communicating clearly?
There's some really interesting research out there, and one of the main models we use is called the Job Demands, Resources and Control model. So, and what's interesting about this is your stress levels in a work organization is coming from, firstly, the job demands. So typically emotional load, the difficulty of decisions, the challenging clients, difficult colleagues you have to deal with. The cognitive load, which means the difficulty of the actual work that you do, but then also the sheer workload, so the volume of things. But what we've seen that's absolutely beautiful is even if those things are quite heavy, that's not the only reason why people get distressed, because it comes back to the resources at your disposal. So physical resources, equipment, infrastructure, IT, but also things like support from line managers, the ability to have somebody to talk to get some guidance, things like just feeling there's a career pathway for me. And then the most interesting factor kind of underpinning both of these, which is a sense of control. Even if it's false control, if people believe at least they've got some control over the diary, something like flexible working, and they've got a say in the way things happen, it seems to be a great mediating factor in alleviating stress. So organizations that are too rigid and prescriptive, sometimes they might still get the results, but they're going to pay the human factor price, specifically in the form of people's mental health.
And if you are observing that a team member or a colleague is facing mental stress, anxiety, facing other challenges, do you have some advice on how you can support these people, these colleagues?
We give a lot of training on this topic for managers to lead for well-being and mental health, which firstly is just to debunk some of the myths. So we explain how depression and anxiety, the typical common mental disorders, for example, would work. But once you spot somebody who's veering from the baseline, just how do you approach them? Because very often a part of the problem is somebody who starts dipping into this space of slightly reduced mental health. They feel very isolated and alone. They feel nobody will understand. They feel it will always stay the same. So sometimes just reaching out and asking a question, just checking in how they're doing, plays such a huge role. But bear in mind one interesting thing. If you ask somebody, how are you doing? We have a verbal reflex to say, I'm very well, thanks, how are you? So they effectively say you need to ask at least 3 times before somebody will really tell you how they are doing. So we just need to be subtle, but sometimes persistent in checking in when somebody seems to be in a slightly bad space.
So I would have to repeat my question from the beginning at least 2 more times.
Yes. So not forcefully, but just subtly. Just say, but how are you really doing? You don't seem to be yourself. So just try and bridge that initial verbal reflection and just see where they are really at.
Pieter, there's so many questions that I would love to ask you, but we are slowly coming to an end of this conversation. However, before I let you go, I would love to invite you to do a short word wrap with me, if that's fine for you.
I'll try my best.
So I will read out a few words, a few terms, and you can reply with whatever comes to your mind. That can be a word, a sentence, or even a short story. And the first one is stress.
Control.
Cycling.
Enjoyment.
Coaching.
Results.
Adventure.
Outdoors.
Nature.
Tranquil.
And last but not least, your message to the world.
Oh, wow. I don't get asked that in such a concise way very often. I'd say one day at a time, control the controllables. If you worry about something you cannot control, it's like sitting in a rocking chair. Gives you something to do, but it takes you nowhere. So let's just focus one day at a time on the things that we can control.
Thank you for that practical advice and for that positive ending to the conversation.
Thank you, Alex. It was an absolute pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Pieter, and thank you everybody for listening. Make sure to check out Pieter Kruger's work online. You will find a lot of interesting articles and information. Make sure to subscribe to Greiner Talks and see you soon.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.